We have been in possibly one of the longest single series we've done since the beginning of Life Church. We've been in the Sermon on the Mount for over 2 months now. But it stayed fresh to me because there's so much stuff in it. It's so dense. What Jesus does is, if you've been with us for at least one of the weeks before, he covers this ridiculously wide range of topics. There's so much stuff, from prayer to dealing with family to how to actually live out the commandments that God gave us. It's this massive display of topics. And so every single week we get to cover a whole different thing. And it's really cool. We really enjoyed it. And so what we've done is we looked at chapter 5, and there was all kinds of stuff in chapter 5, and we finally moved on to chapter 6 2 weeks ago. And chapter 6 starts off with a warning. So what Jesus does in chapter 5 is he shows us, okay, this is how you live life correctly. Like if you want to live a functional life, here's how you should do it. And then in chapter 6 he says, now hold on a second, there is a thing that if you let it in your life and you just let it go and do whatever it wants to do, it can single-handedly twist your whole life around. And so we talked about that 2 weeks ago, and that thing is obsession with the opinions of other people. Obsession with what other people think about you. And we looked at that in depth. You can go online and watch the video. But Jesus basically said, if you let this thing, if you let obsession with the opinions of other people just run free in your life, it can single-handedly mess you up. It can single-handedly throw you out of the abundant life that I'm calling you into. Now, what I didn't tell you guys 2 weeks ago when we talked about this was that Jesus doesn't stop with the first warning. It's actually just one of 2 warnings that he gives us in chapter 6. The first warning takes up about half of chapter 6, and the second one covers the second half of chapter 6. And it's another thing. It's a list of 2 in which he says, these are 2 things that you've really got to be careful about, because both of them have the potential to mess your life up, to mess your focus up, to mess your will and your actions up. You've got to really watch out for these 2 things. And so it's very much in our best interest to listen up to what he has to say, since he's going out of his way to specifically warn us about these 2 things before he moves on into anything else in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's jump in and see what he has to say, because it's really profound. It's really interesting. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. And we'll have it up on the screen, but if you want to follow along, well, you can read in your Bibles. Jesus says this. He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You guys have probably heard this at least once before, right? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's one of the common phrases that makes it out of the Bible in a secular culture occasionally. So are we all relatively familiar with what Jesus means by treasure? Don't lay up treasures on earth, lay up treasures in heaven. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. I think it's more or less, we get the idea that he's talking about the things that we really value, right? The things that we value the most. Really, he's talking about the things that are in your life that you place the top priority on. If you have a priority list, whatever's at the top of your priority list, well, these are the things that you treasure. And so he makes a pretty straightforward point here. I mean, you can't really mess this one up too bad. If we place our ultimate value, or our top priority, on things of the world, we're setting ourselves up for failure and for disappointment. It's a pretty straightforward point he makes, because that stuff is not going to last, right? It's stuff that will fade away. As he puts it, moth and rust and thieves can mess with that stuff, can ruin the stuff that you place your priority on if it's stuff of the earth. It's all going to fade away eventually. And this is it's an important point that he makes, because human beings, we just have a tendency towards this. We really like to put our treasure or our priorities on stuff around us, on earthly, temporal stuff. And really, I mean, if you think about it, this society today, much of it is built around the idea of getting earthly treasures, getting earthly stuff. It's like, this is what you do. It's the rat race. You got to get the stuff. And really, I should mention here that this can apply to any number of things. For instance, it's very common for people to treasure others' opinions of them, to place that at the top of their priority list, as we talked about 2 weeks ago. And as Jesus talked about a few verses earlier. But specifically, what do you think Jesus is talking about here? He's talking about treasures on earth, not those things, but treasures in heaven. Where your treasures, your heart will be also. Any guesses as to what specifically he's talking about? He actually tells us. The next verse down, he says in verse 24, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Money. He's talking about money. Material wealth. Because, to be realistic, if there's anything that we tend to place our priority on, to make our treasure, literally, it's money, right? It's material wealth. This is what we do. Don't you love talking about money in church? Here we go. This is what he's talking about. You can't serve both God and money. That's a plain statement. It's a very blunt statement. You can't serve both God and the buck, the greenback, the dollar bill, that thing that makes the world go around. But, let's be honest. If there's anything that this culture does, it's obsessed with that, right? If there's anything that we tend to hold closest to our hearts, that's what you'd categorize as earthly, it's got to be that. I don't think it'd be an overstatement to say that we live in a culture that is obsessed with material wealth. We're obsessed with it. And it seems like it's a problem that mankind has always struggled with. It's always dealt with, materialism. But I'd say perhaps it's even more prevalent today, perhaps, than it was in Jesus' day. Because the Jews dealt with it back then. This is why Jesus was pointing it out. But I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. It never ceases to amaze me that every single one of the points Jesus makes is every bit as relevant today as it was then. And yeah, we deal with this thing. Because that's the thing. We're taught by society, by those around us, by the media. We're taught that we have to place our priority on money, on material wealth, because that's the thing that's going to give us fulfillment, right? That's the thing it's going to make us happy. That's the picture that's painted, especially by advertisements. I don't remember what the car was, but I saw a car ad once that said, "You can buy happiness." As in, okay, well, you actually can use your money to purchase happiness, and happiness is in this vehicle. Well, I want to be happy, so I guess I should buy the car, right? I saw a similar Chevy ad once. It said, "Chevrolet makes you feel good inside." Really? I want to feel good inside. Do you want to feel good inside? Well, we need to get a Chevy. Does anyone own a Chevy? I don't own a Chevy. This is a problem. This is what we're told by society, though, by Hollywood, by the media. If you want to have a satisfied existence, well, you got to get the stuff. You got to get the nice car. You got to get the nice TV. Whatever it is, you got to have the nice new thing. And it's got to be new, right? Because the old thing is no longer cool. Even if it's 6 months old, it's no longer cool. If you don't have the newest version, well, then you're out of touch with reality. You're not cutting edge. Cell phones. Guys, I'm just going to say it. There's nothing and nobody worse about this than Apple fans. So here's the thing. Whether it's the newest iPhone, or the newest iPad, or whatever it is, every time the newest iteration releases, all over my Facebook, there's people trying to sell their older model. Now, not everybody. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone who owns an Apple product. It's whatever. I think my dad owns one. No, did you? At one point? Kanan owns one. He's an Apple fan. That's fine, but all over Facebook, I see, especially with the iPad, I see it all over the place. The new iPad comes out, and then people who have no business, financially speaking, of doing this will sell their old iPad for beans in order to get the new one that has a marginal spec upgrade. This is what we do in this culture. You got to have the newest, the brightest, the most gleamy, sparkly thing, the new thing, because that's what makes us happy. That's what'll give us fulfillment. I got to get the stuff because I got to be happy. There's a bumper sticker out there that says, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Really? That's our standard of a successful life. I died with more stuff than you. I was actually, after the service last night, I was talking with somebody, and they were talking about this message to me, and they said, I'm friends with some extremely wealthy people, and This one gentleman who's a multimillionaire told me, he said, you're never going to see a U-Haul behind a hearse. That makes sense? You're never going to see people taking all their possessions with them when they die, because it's going to go away. But this is what we believe. If you die with the most toys, well, you have lived a successful life. Well, I died with like $500 more in the bank than you did. I guess I had a more successful existence. That's sad. That seems really sad to me. It seems to me that this culture is to a large degree, it's sick. Our values are twisted. What we consider to be a worthwhile existence is depressing, if you think about it. Really? Like, that's what this is all about? I don't want to live life if that's what it's all about. We call, in the society, we call covetousness ambition, and we call what is greed, we call it industry. So the culture is sick. We're twisted, and yet we conform to it unquestioningly most of the time. Even the church. We just follow along in the trail the media has laid for us. And some people who experience the peak of worldly success, of what the world says this is all about, they've begun to realize that it doesn't really offer the satisfaction that it's been said to offer. You guys ever heard of Leo Tolstoy? One of my favorite authors. Realistically speaking, he's one of the most successful authors the world's ever seen. He, at one point in his life, having experienced incredible success as an author, he went into a crippling, suffocating, lengthy period of depression in his life because he came to the realization that everything that he valued, everything that he treasured here on earth would eventually matter not at all. It would eventually fade away. He was going to die and leave it all behind, and none of it will have mattered at all. And he was crippled by this depression because of this realization. Everything that I hold dear is not going to matter. Now, what's happy about the story of Leo Tolstoy is he found a better alternative in Jesus Christ. And he ended up being ushered into a lifestyle that was full of abundant fulfillment. And that's the thing. If we make our treasure our money, if we make our treasure our financial state, we've sealed our fate. And our fate is worry. Our fate is anxiety. Our fate is frustration. That's just the way it is. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this kind of thing before. I don't know of anyone who hasn't, at one point or another, become stressed out about finances. Often it gets extreme. You guys know, this is interesting. The words anxiety and worry both have as their roots in words, the roots in the concept of the idea of being strangled or choked. Interesting? That's kind of how it feels, yeah? When financial stuff has you anxious, has you worried, has you stressed out, it feels like events and situations beyond your control have you by the throat, choking the life out of you. There's nothing you can do. I've definitely experienced that before. Has anyone experienced this? It's suffocating. It's miserable. Debilitating. So my wife and I were missionaries for a time, and we had our monthly income was very sporadic. And so every single month we'd be in the red. Going, okay, how in the world are we going to pay these bills? And every single month I would get so laid out by stress and worry. I would literally just lay on the couch like, what can I do about this? How can I provide for my family? It was debilitating. There's no better word. Crippling. This is just how it is. And Jesus is no dummy. He's very well aware that we do this. He's well aware that we get so stressed out and anxious about money stuff, financial stuff. And he's well aware that it's because we make that our treasure. We make that our priority. And so this is why he gives us the warning. There are few things that can single-handedly mess your life up as powerfully as obsession with your financial state, as the priority being pushed on money and finances, as materialism. There are few things as dangerous as that. And Jesus knows. Jesus knows we stress over this. The next verse down, he says this, do not be anxious about your life. Do not be anxious about what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body or what you will wear. Don't be anxious about your stuff. Don't be anxious about your finances. Don't be anxious about your provision. That sounds nice, right? To not have to be anxious about any of that. But easier said than done, yeah? Because everyone struggles with this to some degree. Even when you try not to. How in the world are we supposed to just not worry about this stuff? I mean, even in our secular culture today, we've begun to realize that stress and worry about finances is bad for you. Yeah? Just Google it. You'll find a plethora of studies linking stress and anxiety to the detriment of mental and physical health. Just how it is. So we try to find our own little cures. Maybe it's maybe you listen to a song that says, "Don't worry, be happy on your way to work." Maybe you pay $250 an hour to a therapist who will help you discuss your problems, which further inflames the financial problem. Whatever it is, we try to find our own little solutions. But I, for one, haven't been too impressed with the home remedies we come up with. I mean, is that really the best we have? Are those our best options? Happily enough, the answer, it turns out, is no. Those are not our best options. Because Jesus does not leave us hanging. Jesus never shows us a problem and says, "Hey, this is a problem," and then just leaves us to figure it out on our own. Immediately after he says that, he presents us with a solution. So let's listen to what he has to say. Once again, he says, "Do not treasure the things on earth. Do not treasure the things in heaven." He says, "Where your treasure is, your heart will be also." So he says, do not be anxious about your life. You cannot serve both God and money. Don't be anxious about your provision, about your finances. And then he says this, in verse 26, "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" And he says, "Which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life?" That's a pretty good point. And finally, in wrapping up his point, he says in verse 33, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." What a cool statement, huh? There's a lot of cool statements in there. There's a lot of really valuable truth. But the bottom line is the first main part of the solution to this thing, this problem we have, this bent towards materialism, this bent towards obsession with our financial state, the first part of the solution, as he's saying here, is we have to begin to trust God as our provider. We have to begin to trust God with our finances. We have to begin to focus our treasure not on this stuff, but on the things that God says truly matter, because God knows what truly matters. We have to begin to recognize that God loves us enough to take care of us. He takes care of the birds, and we're so much more precious in his eyes than a bird. That's the big thing. We have to have our trust on God instead of finances, because our finances are always going to fluctuate. The world is not nice enough to let them be steady all the time. But God is the only foundation that we can have that's never going to fail us. If our finances are our foundation, we're going to go into flux every time they get messy. God alone is a foundation that's not going to fail us. God alone is able to provide our life with stability. In God alone can we find that kind of security and identity that we're looking for. It's just the way it is. It's just how it is. And so what we have to do is learn that to actively move our trust off of our finances, especially in times when our finances threaten to make us anxious or worried. Move the trust off of our finances and on to God as our provider, because he is our provider. He's not just our provider, but he's the source of our wealth. Everything you have, it's because of him. This is crucial. It's crucial that we learn to do that. Because if we don't, we are going to consistently fall into the same trap of materialism and trust in finances that dominates this culture. We just will. And so the bigger question here is, how do we actually learn how to do this? To move our trust off our finances and onto God? How can we begin to cultivate a heart that trusts God as our provider? How can we practice trusting God with our finances, trusting God with our provision?
This is going to bring us into part 2 of the solution to this whole problem. But really, there are a couple ways to do this. But I'm going to tell you the one that I've seen to be hands down the most effective in dealing with our materialistic bent and dealing with the trust of wealth and finances. And I've seen this thing work over and over again in the lives of others, and I've seen it working in my life. It's this. We must begin to develop generosity in our lives. We have to begin to develop generosity in our lives. Because something that you're going to notice about people who truly and completely trust God with their finances is they're always generous. Always. You won't find an exception to that. Why is this? Because they know who the source of their wealth is, they know who their provider is, and they trust him with it all. They trust him with it all. And that kind of trust you can have in God frees you to give, because it's not something you have to hold so close to your chest. It's mine, mine. Materialism says, get it, get stuff. So of course the antidote is to give. And there's no better way to counteract placing our trust and security and identity in our finances and our wealth than to actively give back to God by helping the needy around us, by lifting up the ministries that are doing God's work around us. There's no better way to practice actively trusting God with your finances. There just isn't. And this is why throughout the Bible, God causes people to do this. He's not an arbitrary God. He doesn't call us to do things just because. And he says, I'm calling you to help those needy around you. I'm calling to support those ministries around you. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, it makes the point that one of the main purposes of the concept of the tithe is to cultivate trust in God for your finances. Isn't that interesting? It actually says that. It's one of the main purposes of the tithe in general, to cultivate a trust in God for your finances. It teaches us to arrange our priorities. It teaches us to arrange our life's treasures, if you will. And God calls us to do this because he knows and because he wants what is best for us. I don't want you to be wrapped up in an obsession with wealth. I don't want you to have your security and stability wrapped up in your money and your finances. I want you to be free. I want you to be free to live the life I called you to, not wrapped up in this concern for your wealth. I want you to be able to trust me as your provider because I am your provider. Isn't that cool? I think it's really cool. And so as we wrap up here, bottom line is this. If you're not actively practicing trusting God with your finances, if you're not consistently giving back to him from your finances, you need to start. You need to start. And I don't care where you give to. I mean, it's important to be prudent and to give to those needy around you and those ministries that are going to make good use of your generosity. But wherever you're giving to, wherever it is, whatever the context is, you need to be giving back to God. Or consistently, you're going to be swept along with the current of this culture that says, place your trust in your wealth, because there's where your security is. You can secure your own security. You can secure your own identity with money. And it's just not true. It's a lie. You need to be giving back to God, whatever the context is. If you have no idea where to start, the Bible recommends 10% of your income. And when God first called my wife and I to that, we're 10%. We're 25% into the red already. 10% is not going to help. But as we begin to follow him by faith into this calling, increasingly, I trust him as my provider because I've seen him provide over and over and over and over again. I've seen him provide too many darn times to not believe that he's not my provider. He is my provider. And so as you begin to follow God in faith and giving back to him, the trust and security you place in your own money is going to be broken and weakened more and more. And increasingly, God is your provider. That's just how it is. God's your daddy. God's your provider. So, Father, thank you that you are our provider. Thank you that you value us so greatly. We're so precious in your eyes. You keep us safe. You provide for us, Lord, and we're so grateful. God, you know how big a problem this materialistic bent is in our culture, and you know how easily it is to be swept along in this current. But for those of us who have been challenged this morning by what Jesus has said in the Sermon on the Mount, Father, I pray you'd help us. You'd come alongside us and help us to begin to actively trust you more and more and more with our finances. We love you, Father. Amen.